please, for David. Thanks, David.
Well, good morning. It's fantastic to be here. This obviously is a really key event for Sky. We've been partnering with the BYP for a number of years. From 2019, we were one of the actual first investors, and it really underlines our commitment to being a force for positive change. So I've been asked today to come and talk to you a little bit about my career and the knowledge that I've acquired over 22 years in this area of work. And I would say that really it's that old adage that the more I learn, the less I know. And my beginnings were quite, I think, quite different from a lot of people who work in this level. So just to talk a little bit about me and my backstory. So you can probably tell from my accent that I'm from Birmingham. I've not lost that. And my parents came to this country in the 1960s. My father is from Trinidad, my mother is Irish, and the society in which they arrived was very different than today. There are some challenges that remain, as we know, but the 1960s and 70s was characterised by landlords that said, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And unfortunately, I had a dog as well called Chummy. So the joke was always that even the dog couldn't find anywhere to stay. But really, the environment in which we all grew up in as a family was really challenging. A mixed family wasn't always welcomed. My mother, who was a social worker at the time, lost her job because she'd had a child outside marriage. And also the child was mixed race, so having a child with a black man wasn't particularly well received in the social services in Birmingham, so she actually left her job. So they fell on quite hard times, and we moved into a very poor area of Birmingham where we were, not particularly welcomed again. And the school system in which we found ourselves, myself and my siblings, was also characterised by a lot of racism and ignorance. So the school teachers weren't particularly inspiring. We were labelled as half-caste kids, and the aspirations that the teachers had for us were extremely low. So when I was placed on ESG, as I was coming up to my GCSEs, I thought, well, that's pretty cool. I get to put car radios in when other people are in lessons. I get to play pool and really not go to any lessons at all. It was fantastic, and I thought I was made. I'd go home and be like, oh, I'm on ESG, this is brilliant. My parents didn't actually recognise what was happening to me at that stage because they didn't have the knowledge of the system. And this whole conference is talking about knowledge is power, but actually having the understanding of what is happening to young people is something that we just don't take for granted. So unfortunately, I left school with no qualifications at all. And my life trajectory was pretty much set to be the same as my parents. So working night shift, working many jobs to make ends meet. And the thing that was quite interesting for me is that in this position I'm in now, I work with lots of people who have got a lot of kind of influence within government and policy. And I was talking to someone last year, and I said, I was on this thing called ESG, but I don't know what it actually meant. And she turned around and said, ESG actually means educationally subnormal group, which actually was quite devastating, even in the position I'm in now, but really showed me the importance of understanding and having knowledge, not only to develop your career, to develop your aspirations, but also to make sure that you get the rights that are due to you. Now, my life changed massively. I met a girl. She came from a really cool, nice part of Birmingham, Solihull, and she was on a trajectory to go to university. And in fact, I took her in my car to university, and I'd never seen anything like it. A place where people actually wanted to go, where they could learn, and the environment was so encouraging. So I started doing night school classes. So I was working in the day, doing night school, and eventually got a few A-levels, and then had to make the decision to go to university. But what that experience showed me was that knowledge, again, is incredibly powerful. Her family had the knowledge in order to make the system work for them and understand what support I needed. So it transformed my life, and I can say without reservation that if I'd not met Sophie as it was, my life would have been very, very different. Now, you would have thought that would have been the end of it. So I went to university, and seat of learning. What an incredible opportunity to learn. But actually, I wasn't ready emotionally. And part of the lesson I learned then was, in order to access knowledge, you have to be in the right place to spot it and to take advantage of it. And certainly, in hindsight, my advice to everyone is to continue to be aware of what knowledge is around you. It's not learning, it's not always training, it's many of the informal relationships we build. So I went to university, got my degree, but actually missed out on so many opportunities because I internalized my view that I was fighting against the world and everybody had it easier, and didn't really have the respect that I should have given to my peers, and in fact lost a lot of opportunities because of it. Now, when I left university, I was going to change the world. I'd experienced disadvantage, discrimination, and fortunately walked into an organisation called the Commission for Racial Equality. And when I say walked into it, I begged for any opportunity to work within the CRE. There were no internships, so I worked voluntarily, making tea at first, and fortunately got the patronage of people within that organisation. Someone put their arm around and said, we'll give you an opportunity to work as a legal officer. Now, without that, I wouldn't have been able to get the knowledge to develop my career. So again, it is consistently opportunities for people to support you, and you have to look out for them. And in that case, I didn't actually wait for permission. I sat there in the reception for 3 hours. They asked me if I had a case that I wanted to make, and I said, no, I actually want a job. So you have to be persistent. It's really important to not take no for an answer, because you will continue to have people tell you that whatever you're aspiring to do is probably a bit ambitious, it's not really practical, there aren't any opportunities. You have to create that space for yourself. So in that role, I developed further knowledge. So my experience, my life, was almost played back to me through the 3,000 race discrimination cases myself and my team worked through each year. Now again, learning about discrimination and the way it manifests itself within employers, within service providers, again, heightened my understanding, heightened my knowledge about how to not only prevent these things happening, but also to see the continual cycle of the same story with the same missed opportunities, with the same laissez-faire attitude to what was then characterised as banter. After a few years, continuing to do that took its toll on me emotionally. These aren't the jobs that you leave at home at the end of the day. You go home thinking about the individuals that you've helped. And in fact, one of the things that I do smile about on my phone still is the name of someone called Mick Henry, who was my first ever race discrimination case. And I used to phone him up just to make sure he was okay. But being really close to those cases gave you the ability to change lives. So whenever we're talking about being change makers, we have to recognise that sometimes that change isn't at a structural or an incredibly high level, it can be at a very individual one. So embrace that opportunity to not only influence others, but support those around you and your peers. My career took another step when I moved into housing and regeneration. So up until then, I'd been a discrimination specialist, someone that was working very close with the communities in which I was trying to help. And then moving into housing was completely different. I understood the link between housing and every other social indicator, whether it's life chances, whether it's employment, education, health. It was one of the biggest indicators of your potential life chances. And I didn't know that. I thought I was an expert, but again, being open to understand what is happening around you is a lifelong vocation, to continue to listen, to continue to be open. Now, the one thing that did really kick through was the continued view of bad apples. And whenever I looked at failing organisations, I always heard that this is just a bad apple. This isn't us. And what that taught me was that if you are going to be inclusive, if you're going to actually contribute to the eradication of racial inequity, you have to stop explaining it away as a bad apple. We talk about inclusion quite a lot, but actually, if you try to be inclusive and ignore the bad behaviour, the rest of the gains are quickly lost. So it is really important to face into that. Every organisation is a microcosm of society. If we don't believe society has racism or prejudice within it, then we're inhibited in trying to change the organisations in which we work. So why did I end up at Sky? I think for me, Sky made a huge commitment following the murder of George Floyd. And I do continue to say the murder of George Floyd. You do hear people talk about the death of George Floyd. He didn't die, he was murdered. And Sky made a huge commitment to be a force for change. So some of the headline things that we did was invest £30 million in actually changing the fabric of Sky, not only as an employer, but also being a force for good in the world. And we call it being a corporate citizen. And the 30 million is a really great example of putting your money where your mouth was, because you can talk a good game, but you really need to invest in it. So that is the lesson that we continue to learn. Now, as we've gone on this journey, we are looking at changing not only our own organisation, but the society in which we live in. So I'm sure that you will see, those of you who subscribe to Sky, those of you who don't, please do, you will see the content that we are putting out. We recognise it's important to not only hold a mirror up to society, but to champion black equity. One of the partnerships that we've recently entered into is with the Black Equity Organisation. So this is a new business and organisation that is there trying to drive equity in housing, in law, in education, and importantly in business. So Sky invested over £1 million in our partnership with the BEO to create new enterprise. Now, the things that we're leaning into are quite challenging. It's not always raising awareness, but we recognise that creating economic wealth within the black community is incredibly important. It enables us to be self-determined and also gives us the ability to do something that I think is quite unique to Sky. Our approach is to create new business through investment, to partner with them and mentor those businesses and create a peer group so people can learn from one another. And then finally, to do something that I think is going to be truly transformational, which is open up our own supply chains. That means that the businesses that we ultimately create will have an opportunity to provide services to Sky. And that creates a circle. So the initial investment is a hand up, not a hand out, and those businesses are sustainable in the long term. So again, it is a complex piece of work, but it's something that we're massively committed to. And the work is ongoing, and only last week I met the first 25 entrepreneurs who have benefited from that program, and they are absolutely inspirational. We've also partnered with Mission 44, and again, this is a charity that is led by Sir Lewis Hamilton, but the project that we're working on is actually leaning into probably one of the biggest issues and persistent issues over the past 30 years, which is the disproportionate exclusion of Black Caribbean and Black African children from our school system. Now, I talked a little bit about my experience, but when in some parts of the country, black kids are 6 times more likely to be excluded than their white peers, there is clearly something that is not working. And the work that we're doing with Mission 44 is actually understanding what is driving that change and what can be done to address it. That may be provision of legal support for children who are excluded, or it could be actually working to create a pipeline of black heads and black teachers to ensure that those schools are representative and also understand some of the challenges that those people will face. Now, internally within Sky, we continue to, as we say, walk the walk, but we recognise that external investment and support needs to be mirrored by the work that we do internally. So we've set out a commitment not only to be more inclusive, but to be more representative. So by 2025, 20% of employees within Sky will come from ethnic minority communities, and 5% will come from black communities. And we've been specific about supporting the equity for the black community in those targets. We employ around 31,000 people, many of them representative of every group, and we've worked really hard to make sure our networks are central to our cultural learning. Now, this has sometimes created a bit of a burden, and when I was at Live Nation, this was also something that happened after the murder of George Floyd. there is a real appetite to find out what the experience of black people has been in society. And there's been an opportunity for many of us to talk for the first time about the experience that we have had. But that's exhausting. Constantly being asked to relive the experiences that you have had is almost like asking people to go through post-traumatic stress disorder. It's painful, it's hard. Talking about racism at a structural level is relatively easy. And for people in D&I like myself, I can talk on a professional level about it. But to talk about your own individual experience is something that is very difficult. Saying to people that actually considerations of racism not only affect where you live or where you send your kids to school, but also where you go on holiday. Thinking, what's it going to be like if I go to this part of the world? And I think that's been truly transformative for many people's understanding, but it has been hard. So what I always say is that only give knowledge, your experience, to people who are willing not only to listen to what you say, but those who are willing to hear and respond to it. So as leaders, it is always a challenge to drive change. Change is never easy. And even in D&I, where you think, well, it's morally the right thing to do, how difficult can it be? Change is always hard because everybody wants change until they are asked to change. You have to develop a resilience and toughness. And part of my learning has been to separate the person from the problem. When you're asking people to change, particularly around emotive areas, people talk passionately. You have various opinions. Diversity by itself is diverse, and it's very unlikely that everybody will agree with the change that you're trying to drive. We all have imposter syndrome. No matter where you exist, there is always that nagging doubt that maybe I'm going to be discovered at any moment as a fraud, that surely I can't be the only person that has doubts. And it is really healthy that people are starting to talk about it. None of you have slipped under the radar. None of us have slipped under the radar. We're all in that position. We're all imposters. But it's important to grow that confidence. And what I would always advise, and my knowledge has been, to grow it in groups. Doing this alone is hard. It is difficult. But find your community of practice who will sit there and support you. You're in a room of very talented people. There is a huge opportunity for you to network and find out about each other. And it is that community of practice that helps us get through those difficult days. And then I come on to authenticity. There is a lot of talk around change, and authenticity is the one commodity that develops trust. We know we're not where we need to be as a society, but we need people's trust in order to drive that change. Resist the temptation to not be authentic, to know your worth. You need to work with people who see that and value you as an individual and what you bring. And if they don't, my advice is always to change your environment. Good organisations see culture fit, not culture add. And over the past few years, I think most of us are starting to realise that we can't just morph into being like somebody else. And certainly at Sky, we don't talk about being a Sky person, because what does that mean? The question is, well, who isn't a Sky person? So always think of yourself as adding to a culture, adding to an organisation, adding to your partnership, because that is the real benefit of diversity, but it takes confidence. If you're not authentic, you don't give up your ideas. You're not creative, you're not innovative, you're almost working with one hand tied behind your back. And studies show that 37% of people who work in an organisation that they don't feel they are valued or included do the one thing that is absolutely unacceptable, which is to withhold ideas. And when I say unacceptable to a business that thrives on creativity and innovation. What I will leave you with is one saying that really I think has always, really inspired me. But also, I think tries to sum up what I'm trying to say in a really simple way, is that a person who walks on eggshells to keep the peace makes no noise at all. Make noise. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, David. I love that last
Thank you so much for
sentiment
that.
there.
Really, really good.
It was very insightful indeed. That was amazing.
Amazing. But we want to know if anyone in the audience want to ask any questions. Want to ask any
Oh, we've
questions,
got a
anyone?
few hands up. Okay,
Oh,
can
we've got a few
we
hands up.
need the house lights up so we can see.
You can see.
Thank you. We should have a roaming mic somewhere.
There's a microphone over here.
Oh,
Brilliant.
We're
hi.
actually asking people to post their questions onto Slido,
oh.
and we'll ask them.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
Has
if
anybody
people
posted their
can-
questions yet?
We have questions posted.
Yes, fantastic. Okay, good times.
So one of the first questions is, well, thank you for that very inspirational story. If you had to pinpoint 3 key mentors in your 20s, who would they be?
3 what, sorry?
3
Key
key mentors.
Yeah. Oh, in my career? Well, I think the first is a guy called Paul Riddell. He was at the Commission for Racial Equality. He'd been there since it was the Race Relations Board in the 60s and he was just the coolest guy. Honestly, he was such an inspiration. I almost had a hero worship of him because he'd done everything. He was massively committed. He was hugely influential. And I think he was my first kind of hero and mentor. And, he took me under his wing and really gave me the opportunity to be challenged. I think one of the things that's really difficult as you grow is that you have to speak with people who you disagree with. And that can be really challenging. And he really said to me all the time, always go into that room and speak with those who you disagree with. And he actually used to go to BNP rallies as a Jamaican with an 8-inch afro and walk in there. And I made the mistake of going with him. And at that stage, I had a receding afro. And it was the stupidest thing I ever did. So it's great to have a great mentor, but always use your own judgment because we nearly got killed that night. The second, I think, was a guy called Richard Ennis, and he worked at the Homes and Communities Agency, and he was the director of finance. And what he showed me was, I think, I used to go into a room, and I was always that activist, and I was going to always get everything that I wanted. And he used to say to me at the end of a meeting, you went in for 5 things, David, and you got 3 of them. Stop pushing. Because actually knowing where the energy is and when to stop is actually the best part of building a relationship. What you don't want to do is get the 5 things you want, you leave the room and people are like, God, I don't want to work with that guy. He doesn't see the bigger picture. He doesn't see my point of view. So I think that was a really valuable piece of advice that he gave to me. And then the final one is, I would say, Michael Rapino, who is the CEO and president of Live Nation. One of the things that he taught me was during the pandemic, Live Nation, biggest entertainment business in the world, lost 98% of its revenue overnight because of COVID. And he came and spoke every single week to employees. He didn't hide. He reassured them. He invested his own money and said, we're all going to take a 20% pay cut to protect the lowest paid employees within the business. And stay with me, things will get better. Now, that organisation continues to thrive, and in fact, now COVID's open, it's on for record revenues, I think 28 billion, and I don't think you book a stadium in the world until 2025. But it shows that ability to have confidence. And that's the thing we all struggle with, whether we're imposters or not. There are times when we think, we're doing the right thing, but all successful people, and the ones I've observed, continue to believe in the work that they're doing, and they will never, ever waver from that. And I think in that stage, it would have been easy just to hide and not come out and front up, but he did something. I was so impressed. So I'd say those 3 people have been the biggest ones for me.
Thank you. And then another question from Deborah. As a global organisation, how is Sky approaching increasing Black representation in parts of the world where being Black is still very challenging?
I think the way that we're approaching it is to really look at inclusion in the broadest sense. So it is about fairness. The way that we hire has to be fair, it has to be transparent, and also to build trust. You can often ask that question about, well, does talent have a colour? So if you ask people, does talent have a colour? People will go, no. Does talent have a gender? People go, Well, of course not, no. But success sometimes does. So it's these kind of partnerships that we want to enter into. So the conference is great, but it's the work that we do after that, making sure that we continue to give those opportunities to people. And globally, when we do that in some of our markets, so for example, in Germany, we can't monitor areas of race because obviously the history of Germany. But again, by creating the inclusive environment, the inclusive practices, and the consistency around that, you do achieve the diversity. And I've seen that happen over 20 years. So I know it is about that fairness, that transparency and the accountability. Those are the commodities. And I think that's what's going to drive our performance over all of our international territories.
There's an anonymous question
Okay.
that's had 8 votes. You talk about culture add. As a Black person in white spaces, how do we navigate that without being seen as disruptive or aggressive?
Yeah, I think certainly within Sky, we don't have that culture where people are seen as aggressive, but it is something about confidence. And I've said this consistently. You have to be comfortable being in a room that doesn't look like you. And there is no other way around it. I mean, I know that we talk about role models is very important, and it is, but there will be occasions where you have to go into a room where you will be the only black face in that room. And part of the burden, I suppose, and opportunity of leadership is to feel comfortable in that space. But the way you operate in there is to understand your worth, to recognize the fact that you are different, but that is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. And I know it sounds very simple to say, but more difficult to do. But you're talking to a Brummie. Not many of us in senior positions. I could change my accent, but I don't. And that takes time. So I'm not saying the finished article of where I am now is where I was. And in fact, I think the last 10 years has given you and me that Neo moment that you sit there and you think, okay, you've got to be authentic. So navigate that. But if there is bad behaviour, absolutely call it out. It is so important that you don't put up with it, that you call it out and you call it what it is, not lack of inclusion or bias. If it is racism, call it racism. And don't be apologetic about that. So that is my advice. And I hope that from meeting other people in this conference today and also your own networks, you develop that confidence. It's so important. But it is hard.
Yeah, I wanted to say, what do you say to people who are nervous to call out racism in the workplace? Because especially like graduates, for example, they might see it but feel like, I don't have the power to do that right now. Do they just deal with it?
No, I think, as I say, find a community of support around you. So in businesses, lots of them have employee networks, so that can provide a voice around issues without it being specific about you. So it is really difficult in that case. But what I always say, and I used to say this when I was at the CRE dealing with these discrimination cases, often people have put up with stuff for years. And there's been something that's created that impetus, so a performance management approach, or they've been starting to be pushed out of the organisation, and then they raise their concern. But what I did see, and it's really important, and it transformed my understanding, is that you get a lot of power from calling something out. You get a lot of power in calling something out. And what I did see was that people that went through these challenges grow in confidence as they started to put the pieces together. Sometimes it's not obvious. Someone calling someone the N-word or something like that is just rare today in a workplace situation. But it's all the little jibes, the microaggressions, the can you hold my bag? I'm looking for the senior person. Or, you're not what I would imagine to be a group director. You're not typical. So even those little things are things that can chip away at you. You can suddenly say, well, maybe I don't fit in here. But I always say call it out because it will never go away. If you're in an environment where that is tolerated and you're accepting it, there is only one end game. You will eventually leave. You will eventually leave. So you may as well challenge that behaviour because there'll be others like you who may be experiencing the same thing.
I love that. We might just have time for one more. Is there any more? One more question?
There are loads.
Oh.
Julie Barr is in the audience, and she asks, what tips can you give us from your work at Sky around using equity mindset professionally and meeting people where they are to provide the best opportunities?
I think, the mindset is really important. What I would say at somewhere like Sky is there is, I think, a genuine, authentic commitment to be better. We know that we're not as representative as we would like. That's why we set the targets out. So my advice is, as I say, always to be authentic and to put your ideas forward. It is so, so important to say, I don't think something is working for me. And one of the things that we've done at Sky is actually encourage teams to have that discussion, because with any large organisation, you get very macro and micro environments. So you can solve inclusion within a team. You can just say as a manager or as a leader, is there anything I can do that will help you perform more effectively? And if that's about the culture and the way of doing things, then so be it. So that is my advice, to always ask your leaders, ask your managers, ask those around you to be better.
Thank you.